This might actually not apply to everybody here because some of you may have read some Chesterton, but G.K. Chesterton is probably the most important author that you've never read, or that your friends have never read, or that your neighbors have never read. And that's one of our goals this evening, would be give you a sense of the man, his character, his personality, and also his importance in Catholic culture and thought.
Okay, so tonight's, we're hoping to have a little back and forth and a little conversation, and most importantly, your questions on this, what I consider to be somebody who has been an inspiration to me, and we'll talk more about the possibility of G.K. Chesterton sainthood a little later in the presentation, but someone that at least I'm confident is with us and supporting us from heaven, even as we speak right now. Are we looking at what do these folks have in common?
Yep, I see that. Okay,
so I know, Father, all due respect to you, the right answer is almost always Jesus. You know, and I would completely concur with that, except this one instance. So we have on here, I don't know if you can name the personas. We have in the middle Mahatma Gandhi. Anybody else? Can anybody throw in the chat line? See if you can name these people on this slide. Yeah.
Yep.
J.K. Rowling came up quick. Very good. Bishop.
Good.
He is a bishop.
Fulton Sheen.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. Three more. Sorry. I will wait.
Tolkien.
I will wait. Yes, Mumford and Sons.
Mumford
Thank you. Actually, it was because of the great hints. Yeah. And the J.R. Tolkien, we got that. And the hardest one is
God bless his heart.
He's an Irish dissident.
God bless the Irish.
Not Father Jim, but a different Irish dissident by the name of Michael Collins. All of these people were influenced in significant ways, or at least would have spoken in their lives to the influence of G.K. Chesterton on their life. And if Mumford and Sons, for example, I think it's Little Lion Man, where it's largely taken from a lot of G.K. Chesterton work. So each one of them in their own individual way was influenced a significant part by G.K. Chesterton.
Should we have a signal for slide?
Yeah. So there's your answer, of course. G.K. was himself an artist. He wasn't. I don't know if he was a particularly good artist, to be honest with you. But he did attend the Slade School of Art for a period of time. And you see on the left an artistic rendition of himself, and to the right a more realistic pose of G.K. Chesterton there.
So Chesterton has a widespread influence even today. So Michael Collins, who not just a dissident, but actually one of the first proponents of Irish republicanism, took a lot of his ideas of sort of a national ability to determine your own future from Chesterton, as did Gandhi. And a lot of Gandhi's ideas of an independent India actually come from an Englishman, which is something that is not often enough appreciated. People like Alfred Hitchcock, or the great director Orson Welles, or the writers Hemingway, J.K. Rowling, J.R.R. Tolkien. In music, Mumford and Sons, of course. I think actually specifically a quote from Chesterton's work on St. Francis of Assisi. Marshall McLuhan, Neil Gaiman, the famous comic book artist, has a character in his famous Sandman series, which I've never actually read, except that I know that he's got a character named Gilbert in there. Bishop Fulton Sheen, Ingmar Bergman, C.S. Lewis actually credits Everlasting Man as being one of the books that helped him in his conversion story, and many, many more that are influenced by Chesterton. And so
when I heard today, the first person to give him a job in the writing industry, G.K. Chesterton, when he owned his weekly magazine, gave George Orwell his first writing job, as a matter of fact. Famous for 1984.
Slide.
Oh, right, I'm on here. That's me.
Was that you?
Yeah. So G.K. Chesterton was also he is the second Englishman to be named defender of the faith by a pope in the church. Prior to G.K. Chesterton, the last Englishman to be named defender of the pope was, ironically, anybody. Oh, this would be good. Good questions. This is a good crew. Let's see. I wouldn't try this with an adult crowd, to be honest. But why not? Who was the previous Englishman to be named defender of the faith prior to G.K. Chesterton? Any guesses in the chat box? Do not afraid to be wrong.
It is a king. That's pretty good.
It's a king. Yeah, not Shakespeare. Yeah, Shakespeare, I would say, was a defender of the faith before Shakespeare. By the way, that'll be your guess. But it's only coming out now that Shakespeare's Catholicism is only really kind of coming out in the last little bit in a significant way. Any other guesses? King George the First, good guess. King Arthur, definitely a defender of the faith. Henry VIII, yeah, very good.
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII, ironically named as defender of the faith. After
which didn't go particularly well. Henry VIII left the church but kept the title, which is an interesting detail. When upon Chesterton's death, the Pope Pius the 11th sent a telegram, an open telegram to the UK, basically expressing his condolences on the passing of this great English son, this defender of the faith. And because the English were quite prickly and concerned and very aware that Henry VIII had been named a defender of the faith, most English newspapers at the time did not run that part of the telegram.
And just for my son in the audience there, Henry VIII was named defender of the church I would suggest in large part for publishing stuff that actually St. Thomas More wrote. But anyway,
that's true. So in terms of a short biography, a large man, because he was an enormous man, he published over 15 million words. And if anybody says to you, I've read everything that Chesterton has ever written, they are either mistaken or caught in the act of a falsehood, or a very unusual person that you should get to know. Absolutely. He wrote over 100 books, contributions to over 100 more, over 4,000 essays. He edited for a time his own magazine and debated some of the great minds of his day, Clarence Darrow, H.G. Wells, who at the time was probably the most famous champion of what he would have considered a rational atheism. George Bernard Shaw, also a well-renowned rational atheist and a playwright, an Irishman, and a good friend of Chesterton's. And people back in the day, far before mass entertainment that we'd be familiar with, would travel for miles to hear Chesterton debate with these people.
Chesterton called himself the politest man in England, which is quite a thing. He wasn't usually prone to arrogance, but in that statement he was. And the reason is because he said, I can stand up and offer my seat to 3 ladies on a bus. The image that we've portrayed maybe so far gives you some sense that perhaps this is some stodgy writer who's locked away and writing theology. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a happy warrior will be the line I steal from Bishop Barron on that. Bishop Barron's kind of, I think, coined that phrase, happy warrior, in reference to G.K. Chesterton. A person whose joy, evangelization through joy, was obvious. He nothing more than taking shots at himself. He was trying to get into a taxi cab one day, apparently, according to the story, and he couldn't. He was having a hard time getting in. He was a large fellow, and they said, "Well, perhaps if you go sideways." To which he responded, "Sir, I have no sideways." It was just round. He carried a sword stick and apparently a revolver, which he said he carried in defense of his bride. I'm going to go back to that because we don't do that anywhere else here, and I think it's very important. The previous picture, the previous, still GK, yeah, oh yeah, that's where I'm at. G.K. Chesterton was married, had no children. The Chestertons could not have children, much to their disappointment. It was something very sad in their lives. we intentionally used the picture of him with the little girl there because he's very well known for they were parents to the entire block of children. People would come to their homes, children would come to their homes, have dinner. He would entertain the little ones by throwing up buns and catching them in his mouth and so on. He, a great tragedy that they couldn't have children, but he served as spiritual father to many, and he loved the innocence, the joyfulness, and the energy of children in his life.
Which I think in many ways he tried to emulate himself. Because he felt that humility was so very, very important. When he's making all of these jokes about his own size, he thinks, that's a part of humility, which is a part of sanctity. And Chesterton says is because angels take themselves lightly that they can fly. So he wrote in his time theology, history, literary criticism, there was nothing that he wasn't willing to write about: politics, poetry, detective stories. His father Brown's stories have been made into numerous series, plays, biographies. His thoughts really are quite prophetic. They're just as relevant today as they were 100 years ago. And you're quite stricken, I think, if you were to read some of his work on globalization or on government or big business, etc. And a wonderful thing about reading Chesterton is that you find yourself seeing your own thoughts expressed better, or your tendencies expressed better than you can express them. And I know that when Paul and I were looking at kind of putting together this presentation, part of the conversation was, well, how long ago has it been since we first started talking about Chesterton? Paul introduced me to Chesterton over 25 years ago. And so it's been a part of our formation, is one of the reasons why we feel so strongly about him.
Part of the reason why he doesn't get talked about as much, I believe, is because he's not a siloed thinker. He doesn't fit into one specific subject or another specific subject. He doesn't fit into history or economics or theology or literature, literary criticism. He does it all. He's a complete thinker, and that's one of the works on him by Dale Ahlquist. It's called The Complete Thinker. Very good work if you want to pick up something about G.K. Chesterton. He did much of his writing in train stations on little pieces of paper that sometimes made it into his pocket. He would come up for a debate and have just little slips of paper in his pocket and around, and have some, not really know where anything was. He once caught a cab to take himself across the street because he didn't really know where he was going. There's a very famous telegraph that he telegraphed his wife at Market Harborough, "Where ought I be?" He had no idea where he was, and he was the 100 years ago version of text messaging his wife saying, "Where am I supposed to go next?" And his wife said appropriately, "Home." This I find very difficult to believe, but there's multiple accounts from multiple secretaries say this, so I always want to include it. Apparently, he was capable of dictating an essay while writing a second essay at the same time. Unbelievable that you're able to think along those lines. He couldn't remember where his shoes were, but he could dictate an essay and write another one at the same time. Oh, we have a whole thing on wives going. I will studiously stay off that part.
I also am a sensible husband and will remain aloof from that conversation. I think another reason why G.K. Chesterton is largely forgotten, except for maybe people who make it their business to study the British literature from the first half of the 20th century, is because a great deal of his time was in the defense of common sense, as he saw it. He called common sense that extinct branch of psychology. And he felt that the most common things are they're not common at all. They're terrible and frightening and profound and beautiful and true. And so I think for him, common sense and Catholicism really were synonymous. And I think that's one of the reasons, the big reason in my mind, of why a lot of his writing has been forgotten, is because it is so very Christian. And he argued so clearly that it is easier to forget Chesterton or ignore him or bury him somewhere than to engage him in argument.
He also was a prince of paradox. He enjoyed a pun, but he enjoyed most, and he often got actually badmouthed in his day for saying, "Oh, that's the guy who does paradox." But he loved paradox. He loved turning things on their head and looking at them upside down. To be startled by the sun, not the eclipse. To wonder at the earth, not the earthquake. And you look at our faith, you see paradoxes galore, right? To think of things like the last shall be first, blessed are the meek, die to receive eternal life, or the ultimate paradox that I think GK was in service of most of his life was God and man come together in Christ.
So Alquist says there's almost no topic to which he has not at least made reference, usually provocatively, always profoundly, and there are some important themes in his writing that we'll roll through.
That was quick. Wonder. The world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder. G.K. Chesterton, very brief biography, went to St. Paul's, which was a prestigious school, but he says his teachers knew him for his ability to sleep in their classes, and so off he went. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He went to the Slade School of Art because he had some propensity for art. He didn't do particularly well there, and it was a relatively nihilistic place. There was a lot of attacks on certainly any kind of traditional Christian belief at that time, as there are now in our society. And so this led him into a kind of a dark period, and some say he may have struggled with some depression his entire life. But what he came to through reading, especially poetry, people like Walt Whitman, was this understanding that I need to be appreciative. I need to be grateful for my life. And if I'm going to be grateful, then I need to be grateful to someone. And this idea of wonder and gratitude sat with him for his entire life and informed his works throughout the rest of his life. He was born and raised in the Anglican Church, but his parents were progressives, Unitarians. They wouldn't be called church-going Anglicans. So at this point, G.K. Chesterton is kind of a wandering Anglican.
And maybe just one more brief word on wonder. He tells a story of two boys who are each granted a wish, and one wishes to be made enormous and a giant, and the other wishes to be made very, very small. And the giant is granted his wish, and he goes striding across the earth, stepping over mountains, wading across oceans, and over the course of an afternoon walks around the globe 2 or 3 times and gets bored because he's rather jaded and falls asleep, and that's the end of him. The other boy, who is wished more wisely to be made very, very small, suddenly is surrounded by an enormous exotic forest full of incredible colors, and he goes on this wonderful, wonderful adventure towards this enormous sort of flaming tree, which is just a dandelion, and spends the rest of his days just exploring the backyard full of wonder. And so there's a sense with Chesterton then that wonder is one of the fruits of humility. Actually, that everything seems so big and worthy of gratitude because we're not thinking about ourselves. When he is asked why was he Catholic, his first response was simply, well, because it's true. But he also says there's 10,000 reasons amounting to one reason that it is true. And I don't know how legible this is here, so I'll just read it. He writes, a Catholic is a person who has plucked up courage to face the incredible and inconceivable idea that something else may be wiser than he is.
Oh, very good. Yeah. Another good response to why did he become Catholic was a simple line: to have my sins forgiven. So he came full circle on that. He, as mentioned previously, he was passionate and unequivocal in matters of truth. but he certainly invited dialogue and was friends and friendly to everyone he debated. He is lifelong friends with George Bernard Shaw. They disagreed on everything. George Bernard Shaw was a deist, so had a very loose belief in God at best. They disagreed on economics and political issues. George Bernard Shaw was a vegetarian and a teetotaler. He didn't imbibe of the alcohol, and G.K. Chesterton was not a vegetarian nor a teetotaler. One quick anecdote: they were debating each other at one point, and George Bernard Shaw, a very slight man, said to oh no, it was the other way around. Chesterton said to Shaw, to look at you, sir, you'd think there was a plague, or not a plague. What's the word? Stefan, geez, I lost. When there's no food, what do you call that?
A famine upon the land.
A famine in the land. And Shaw said, well, to look at you, sir, you'd think you caused it. So they were good friends, but they bitterly disagreed. And the austere-looking fellow in the middle there is another great friend of theirs by the name of Hilaire Belloc. He's a contemporary of both of these as well.
So he had a great deal to say about economics and politics that'd be really useful, I think, for North Americans, in that he was suspicious of both big business and big government. He called them Hudge and Gudge. That really their goal was the same, was to draw all power unto themselves and to remove it from the average small person. And so big business and big government, often the left is in favor of big government and the right is in favor of big business. But in Chesterton's mind, they're not to be trusted. They're actually secretly in cahoots.
So Chesterton was a fan of and inspired the work "Small is Beautiful," and he was informed. He's a big fan of local business, of doing things yourself. That is the line: if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. It's not just an attempt at humor or a reflection on this talk. It is, in fact, an ability mentioning for people to say, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing yourself. And trying for yourself and making things on your own.
He also was one of the fathers of like a very little known economic system known as called distributism, which is in favor of private ownership, but more private ownership. In Chesterton's mind, the problem with capitalism today is actually that there is not enough private ownership of property, and so distributing the wealth so that actually people own. The sort of the tagline was that everybody have 3 acres and a cow would make for a fairer world.
So he talks about don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason why it was put up. Take a look at what the thing is for until you attack it. Again, he was very famous for attacking conservatives and liberals. He would say liberals like inventing new fallacies, and conservatives try to hold on to the old ones.
So he also was one of the earliest voices crying out against eugenics, and many of some of the dangerous ideas that come along with progressive modernism.
Oh, good. Okay. We put this a great introduction for high school, so eugenics and other evils. He attacked a great many things, and we'll talk about this work later. And he wrote a book called
What's it about? What's Wrong with the World? No.
What's Wrong with the World? Thank you. He wrote What's Wrong with the World. That's where a lot of his economic theory came out, and he was attacked on saying, that's fine, you can attack everything. You're attacking eugenics and other evils and what's wrong with the world. What do you stand for? And that he wrote a book in response to these critics called Orthodoxy, one of his greatest works to enunciate exactly what it is he stood for, which is Orthodox Christianity, not capital O in the way we think of it right now. Is this me? He was great friends with a fellow by the name of Edmund Clare Hugh Bentley, and we thought if we had time, we were going to engage this a little bit, but we'll show you how. And if somebody wants to throw some in the chat box while we're speaking, great. But otherwise, you could do this whatever you like. The Bentley is the Clarihue is a poetic form, very straightforward poetic form. It is, what is it? AABB, and it's a biographical reference on a person's name that exists in the first line. So the people of Spain think Cervantes equal to half a dozen Dantes, an opinion resented most bitterly by the people of Italy. And the second example.
I like this one. Alexander Graham Bell has shuffled off this mobile cell. He's not talking anymore, but he has a lot to answer for.
And Chesterton and education. He spoke a lot about education, and again, his thinking on education was, well, the upper right one I think is probably the best one. Without education, we are in the horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously. He was a very educated person himself, but he was very much against the expertise notion that we just bow to the experts and we don't think for ourselves and have our own responses to things. Yeah, Stefan?
My favorite is just that education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another. For Chesterton, the past is very, very important. That tradition is not just something that is a kind of communion through time. Tradition is also, in his words, the democracy of the dead. Tradition is the only system within which the dead still have a voice instead of simply silencing them.
And this is my favorite education quote from his. The one thing that is never taught by any chance in the atmosphere of public schools is exactly that there's a whole truth of things, and that in knowing it and speaking it, we are happy. That for Chesterton, his Catholic faith was the light by which everything is seen. It isn't a subject on itself. It is a part of everything we see and everything we do. This is a book I would highly recommend. It has the longest subtitle for a book I've ever seen. How to Finally Acquire an Education While Still in College or Anywhere Else. It is the book I read that introduced me to G.K. Chesterton many years ago. It's by a James Shaw. He is a Jesuit, but we won't hold that against him. May he rest in peace. He actually passed away about a year ago. He's a professor of political philosophy at Georgetown. And it's a book about books. He writes a chapter on a subject, and then he gives several book references. And I was reading this book, and I came across Chesterton time and time again. And I'm like, I have to read this guy. He's referencing him so very much. So there's a book recommendation. But the point of this section was to lead me to my favorite work by G.K. Chesterton, which is The Everlasting Man. This book was written after he did become Catholic, and it was written in response to H.G. Wells had written a book called The Outline of History. And H.G. Wells was writing this book as basically a atheistic history. And you wouldn't know that this book is a response to it. It's in Chesterton fashion. It's not adversarial. It only very subtly mentions the H.G. Wells book a couple of times. But it is a history of humanity from The Man in the Cave, chapter 1, and then the centerpiece is The God in the Cave, speaking about the birth of Jesus, centering all of history around Christ and then the establishment of the church. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful work.
It's such a beautiful book that it's also my favorite book. But my second favorite is Orthodoxy. And there's a vision in Orthodoxy, and it's probably because the impact that it left on me. There's a vision in Orthodoxy that Chesterton shares, that there is nothing that is dull or glum or stodgy about Orthodoxy, that if you look back at the entirety of the 2,000 years of the church, it is a wild and adventure of trying to keep this car on the road, and you know, oh, there's the Arian heresy, and you sort of steer the car this way, and oh, there's those guys, and you steer the car this way. Oh, Gnostics, And so all of this, and it's just this wild adventure actually of trying to maintain the fine line of truth. So that and just the vision that occasionally going off in order to come home is something that we see in Chesterton. I mean, he describes a man who leaves and goes off sailing and then comes to this strange land and finds how odd it is and how bizarre people act, and then realizes that it's home. And so that's for him was sort of it's the homecoming of him being raised in the way that he was, and then ultimately converting to Catholicism.
One of my favorite lines from that last book is, it may be that he, referring to God, has the eternal appetite for infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. Again, this is his love. He actually has an essay in defense of baby worship. So while we're moving on here, if you want to type into the chat any favorites Chesterton works that you have come across, throw them down there, and we'll keep moving on with some other possibilities here for some of his greatest works. Another contender is Poetry, the Ballad of the White Horse, an absolutely beautiful poem that outlines the kingship of Alfred the Great, at some of his lowest moments, and is a very Marian poem. Alfred had a great devotion to Our Lady. Oh, A Piece of Chalk, absolutely. Oh, that's my son. I can't praise him, but look at that, Tom. That's the next slide.
I can't praise him. Thomas, don't let him get away with that.
But it is the next slide. Did you want to say something on A Piece of Chalk, Mr. Tom?
No, I just think it's beautiful. I went from reading a couple of Chesterton books into falling into reading a lot of Chesterton essays, and so I tend to love the essays quite a bit. And so, if you're interested in Chesterton's ideas on globalization versus the small, the local, and the beautiful, read Cheese. If you're interested in his ideas on biological determinism, as opposed to a sacramental view of people, read On Dogs. On Lying in Bed is great. A piece of Chalk is probably my favorite essay, just talking about what virtue is, meaning that virtue is not the absence of vice. Okay, holiness is not the absence of sin. Sin's the absence of holiness. Hatred's not hatred is just like a shadow. Love is the fire.
So that was you not having anything to say on that. Okay.
That's correct.
Father Brown, I'm a big fan of the Father Brown mysteries, and you are most welcome to watch them. However, I don't necessarily think the current Father Brown is a bad show, but it is not Father Brown. Okay, it is. There's a Father Brown character, and he's doing some things. It is not though his works recreated, but the old show from the 1980s, who starred, his name escapes me again tonight. I don't know what's going on.
That is an old show now, Paul.
The BBC put it out, and that one is actually the G.K. Chesterton Father Brown mysteries, but also pick them up. A Blue Cross, I would recommend starting there. It's a magnificent Father Brown work. Man Who Was Thursday, a nightmare. Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, called this a proto-spy novel.
Not easy reading, but pretty cool.
Yeah. The Napoleon of Notting Hill, written in 1904, set 80 years into the future. Funny, hey? And then George Orwell writes a novel. It's kind of a counter 1984 to George Orwell's 1984, I might suggest. He also wrote biographies. His biographies on, he wrote one on Shaw, Charles Dickens. He's a big fan of Dickens, Thomas Aquinas, and Tolstoy. Also St. Francis of Assisi, but his, particularly of this group, his biography on Thomas Aquinas is absolutely fantastic, and a relatively short read.
So among the Jesuits, there's like a subset of the academics known as the Bollandistes, and they're known for hagiography, for the study of saints' lives. And back in Chesterton's days, like one of the most famous Bollandiste academics is Etienne Gilson, who called this book one of the greatest biographies of St. Thomas Aquinas ever, which is pretty cool. And then Charles Dickens also had actually kind of fallen out of favor. People didn't read his books. They didn't know A Christmas Carol the way that we do. And then Chesterton, who was this huge influence, writes Charles Dickens, and then Dickens goes viral again. So he was responsible for a revival in interest in Dickens.
And Charles Dickens, a man who saved Christmas. So we can say indirectly, G.K. Chesterton saved Christmas, Mr. Johnson. Is that right?
That's exactly what I said. Actually.
Is that exactly what you said?
Exactly what I said.
Really? Because I stopped paying attention. So a few key points, and Mrs. Murphy, we're landing the plane here. We are landing the plane. Dickens goes viral again. Just one that I found particularly poignant, I should say, on human rights. When people begin to ignore human dignity, it will not be long before they begin to ignore human rights. I think we can find that to be very relevant for our world today. This is the fascinating piece. Chesterton's a prophet. Right 100 years ago, he was touring the United States making speeches. But if you look at those speeches, they could have been made yesterday, and they're speaking about us today. It's as true now as it was then.
And we tend to blame a particular person or a political party. But when you look at these problems through Chesterton, you see that today what we're seeing politically are the fruits of a tree that has been growing for more than 100 years. It's modernism. So in terms of like the wit and wisdom of Chesterton, we wanted to share a few key quotes with you, so you get a sense of his wit and his wisdom. They don't always go hand in hand.
Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten. He's got a beautiful one on St. George. How was it? St. George went off to slay the dragon because he was heartily afraid of the princess.
Probably the most famous one: a dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it.
I would maintain that thanks are the highest form of thought, and gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder. Again, this is what we spoke to earlier. This is prevalent throughout his career. He was born in 1874. For those of you that 1874, 1876. Gee whiz, one of those two. And he died in 1936. So he was born in 1874 and he died in 1936. And he converted to Catholicism in 1922.
So let your religion be less of a theory and more of a love affair. It's also beautiful.
You've probably heard this one if you've seen any of his quotes. It's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried.
There have been substantive efforts to gather his works. This is not a quote. All which are available free of charge or for very small charge. And so there's two links that we can make that available to you folks. Lots of free Chesterton reading to be done online.
The collected works you should be able to download for free or a couple of bucks is the reality of it. Recently, there has been a move towards looking at Chesterton for possible canonization. And the Society of the American Chesterton Society has renamed itself the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, and it is a Catholic apostolate now, who is dedicated to trying to put forward this cause towards canonization, because they say that we need a saint like G.K. Chesterton. I completely agree with that. However, the bishop in England who is looking into the cause does not agree with that and has set aside the canonization process for now. He had a priest looking into it for a couple of years, and they have set it aside for what may be any number of reasons. but opened the door to another bishop moving it forward. So Father Jim, in a few months when you're His Excellency Father Jim, we anticipate that you'll be moving that one forward. Can you tell us a little about his childhood? Happily. So he was born in, is it Kensington, Kingston? Anyway, a certain section of London. There was a middle class family, and as I mentioned before, Anglican in name, but kind of Unitarian in bent. However, his father made for him a marionette set, with puppets and what a wooden puppet theater, and that was his favorite toy. He loved playing puppets, and I think it really engaged his imagination and this idea of fairy stories that stayed with him his whole life. No, Beaconsfield is where he went to after. Yeah, he died in Beaconsfield. Thank you. Thank you, Trez. I'm glad to see you're listening along with us. But anyway, this idea of fairy stories, and he had a younger brother, Cecil, and when Cecil was born, he said, "I will now always have an audience." So Cecil and him, they fought most of their lives like good brothers should, I think. And then, as I mentioned, it went into St. Paul's and began his education in sleepiness there at St. Paul's. Where would you start with one of his works? Great question. Depends on your interest.
About his works, why not one of the Alquist books?
Yeah. Dale Alquist has a few good books. I mentioned The Complete Thinker, the one with Chesterton 101. Also, that would be the second one I'd recommend on that. However, it depends on what you're interested in. If you're interested in mysteries, then really starting with Father Brown is very good. If you're interested in plays, I was just looking at my shelf, a couple that I haven't. Lepanto. If you're interested in history, that's a fantastic work, but get an annotated version. It's not very long. That's a poem. The Flying In is a nice little romp set in England 100 years from Chesterton's time, so what would be current time. And it has a wheel of cheese and a barrel of rum, and a number of chase scenes in it. So you don't necessarily have, if you're really interested in the key to his theological thinking, orthodoxy would be a great one to start with, but you could start with something fun too, because it all leads to the same place. Yeah, and essays. Yeah, thank you. Oh yes, the Chesterton Academy. Yeah, thank you. Can I begin that and then turn it over to you?
Yeah. It starts with the apostolate that you just mentioned a minute ago.
So 2019, I guess, summer of 2019, I had the great privilege of going to Kansas to the GK Chesterton conference. I've been to a few of them. I love it. There, His Eminence Cardinal Collins was there speaking as well, but mostly wanted to be there as a Chesterton fan. And went to a session on education and learned about the Chesterton Education Network, and wondered if it was possible to map the curriculum with Alberta public education curriculum. Just wondered and made some inquiries and some conversations, and then I involved Stefan in the conversation, and Mrs. Melnick, the principal of St. Isidore, and Mrs. de Champlain Good, who's with us here tonight, Assistant Superintendent of Educational Excellence. And anyway, there was work done at mapping the curriculum, and we decided that starting this virtual online Chesterton Academy might be something that is actually possible. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Johnson.
And it was. Sorry. And it was. And so now we've just launched it for our first year. There's a few of our students here. And that has turned into quite a bit of fun. And what it is ultimately is a way that it's a program that fulfills two different curricula in a way. You are earning Alberta credit. You're hitting all the Alberta competencies in order to earn a diploma in Alberta, but you're sort of doing so in a Chestertonian fashion. And we have 60 kids right now, and after a interesting and exciting, which means too much work in September, I think that we're settling in happily. We kicked off our house system just a couple of weeks ago, which is also fun. So we wanted to thank you for your time. Here's actually, we just like this picture of the great man in a wind. He looks so scowly, very much like a walrus, and yet such a joyful child of God. What a wonderful model.